When selecting the, I would say, primary key for your table, which do you make use of? Do you make use of integers? Do you make use of big integers? Do you make use of, I think there's UUIDs as well. And, do you even make use of text, like a text field, and just generate a random ID, sticking that in there? And that's going to be a primary key for your DB. I have no idea which is the best approach. In the past, I just used big integers because, trying to make sure that we do not exceed the amount of data or the amount of values available in integers is the majority of the reasons why I make use of BigInt for the most part. But recently, I took some time to dive into what exactly exists, and I saw that you could have a lot. I think I saw ULIDs recently, and there's the reason for us having to consider other options was the fact that, number one, running a single instance of the database was easy for us to have, like, the integers and begins work for us fine. But in situations where we wanted to now span out to multiple databases, we now had situations where when trying to migrate data, we ran into issues of having to map the correct ID. So a user of, like, say, an ID 1, when migrating to a new database that already has users, that user's ID, because it's an auto-generated sequence, may now become 54. Now, the problem that exists with that is, on the transactions table, if we have a transactions table, for example, user of ID 1 and user of ID 1 on a different database, they were two different things. So this caused, like, some headache. We had to figure out a way to migrate that in correctly. So that was one of the major reasons why I spent some time looking at the options which we have. So the usual suspect was going to be UUID v4, but pretty quickly we found out that that was not going to be the best approach to make use of as the primary key, mostly because of the nature, or the, should I say, the random nature of the IDs. We're using Postgres, and it doesn't make sense, according to some of the research. It doesn't make sense to make use of a totally random ID due to how B trees, like the B tree data structure works. So it causes lots of page splits. So inserts usually would be slower. So I think there was this article. I'm not sure who this was from. One sec, let me open this up. Yeah, so this one was the one I saw. Yeah, so here where they did an evaluation between BigInt, UUID v7, UUID v4, and UUID but stored as text. Now, this is like taking a note of the time it took to insert a million rows into the database. You can see like how massive the difference is between saving a UUID and saving a big int or an integer. So I think the primary reason why this UUID v7 is faster is due to how UUID v7s are generated. There's an article here as well that, like, or not an article, like, this is the Postgres commit first that shows when UUID v7 is going to come in to the system. So I think this is the patch ID. It's currently committed and it's due to land in the next, I would assume, patch release of PG. But notwithstanding, the key thing to point out is we have these options for primary keys, and the one to make use of is going to be dependent on, like, a lot of factors. So for one, if your DB is going to be single instance, I don't see any reason why you should be worried about, like, using a UUID v4 or even v7. But the key, I think I have this small. Let me show you this small flowchart here to, like, talk about when to use what based on, like, the little research I just carried out. So, like I said, if you are single instance or if you're distributed, if you're going to have, like, a multi-cluster DB across services, it may make sense to, like, go the ES route for the flowchart branch. But let's focus on the no branch first. So let's say you're a single instance. What are the options? Is your table going to be large? So this is particularly important for tables like lookup tables. So tables where you know for sure like this table would never grow above, say, maybe 1 million records. 1 million may even be too much. Maybe this table will never go above, say, let's say 50 records or stuff like that. It doesn't make any sense to use big integers in that situation because one, they consume more space, and secondly, you already know like this table will never grow much more than like the capacity available for the int. So in that situation, just stick to using integers as your primary key. No need to overthink it. But in a situation where you are going to be like needing like much more data on that table, so think about transactions table, think about things like your ledger. In that situation, if you are not going to be exposing the ID publicly, then it may make sense to stick to making use of big integer, because like I said, there's no need to over worry. I think one of the major reasons we also wanted to switch away from big int was we didn't want our public IDs to be something that you could guess. So say for example, we return back in our API response, we return back say for user ID of 4, then you as like an API consumer can easily iterate over the next IDs. I mean, for sure, the permissions and there's authentication on the API, but we don't want it to be possible, more or less, for you to like guess how many users we have on the DB based on like an ID we return back to you. So, but if the ID is not going to be public, yeah, you can stick to using BigInt. Now, for a situation where it's going to be a public ID, do you want your ID to be pretty or not? So, some people do not care about how they don't care about the developer experience of the IDs. So what I mean by that is, say, user ID of ABCDEF is your user ID. That could be a pretty ID, but because of how long UUIDs are, it may make sense to want to like have a better structured ID. So if you're not worried about like the prettiness of your IDs, you could just go with your UUID v7 as your primary key and also expose that as a public key as well. But if you really, really, really care about making sure that your public IDs are pretty, you could make use of this approach of saying, okay, have a primary key as big integers and use a public ID. You could use Nanoid for this case. You could use something else. It doesn't really matter. The key thing is, you just like have an internal primary key, and you have, a public ID, which could be generated, but it has to be unique. Now, for the situation where you have a need for running across multiple instances or running across multiple services, in that situation, it's going to now be, does the ID need to be public? If no, it's a no-brainer. Just make use of UUID v7. In this case, the ID generation can be handed off back to the clients, and also, I mean, you could also use a database to generate the IDs if you want. But the key thing is, if your ID doesn't need to be public, just it's easy. It's just stick to UUID v7, and it's important to make use of the version 7 of UUID, mostly because of the time factor which it introduces. You can read about UUID. Then if it's not going to be public, yeah, it now goes back to that same question. Does it need to be pretty? If yes, go ahead and like generate an internal ID using UUID v7. Then expose a public ID which you can like generate using Nanoid or whatever tool you want to make use of. Otherwise, just stick to using UUID for both your primary key internally and also like the key that will be exposed to the public. So yeah, this, I would say maybe small decision tree should be sufficient enough to choose going forward next time, I guess. But again, it's going to be more nuanced than this. Then I think one last thing I wanted to just point out here is, for the case of, was it this one? I think it was this one. Yeah, so he did run a benchmark as well around how performant this, and I think I found this comment really interesting. So you could like read through this. I would add this for sure. I mean, look at this. Premature optimization is the root of all evil. I do not know what this means, but I mean I know what it means, but come on, it's cliche at this point. But yeah, I will add these links for sure to the thing I'm sending over as well, so you can use this to like catch up or research more. Well, that's all.